Welcome to Think Change. I'm Sara Pantuliano. Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. 3 years on, the war continues to reshape global security and geopolitical landscape. With diplomatic maneuvering intensifying in recent weeks, today we want to discuss one of the most pressing geopolitical questions of our time: Ukraine's future amid shifting international dynamics. On the 18th of February, Russia and the US met for talks, reportedly to lay the groundwork for future cooperation on ending the war. But they met without including Ukraine or European allies. This move has sparked serious concerns about Washington's evolving stance towards Russia and the potential sidelining of Kyiv and Europe in crucial decisions. Meanwhile, European leaders gathered in Paris, scrambling to respond. So amid all the developments, we ask if Europe can sustain its long-term support for Ukraine, and if US backing declines, what options it has to assert its own strategy. And beyond Europe, the US-Russia discussions could have far-reaching global consequences. Could they signal a broader realignment of power? To unpack these issues, I'm joined by a star panel. I'm delighted to have with us Ann Linde. Ann is an ODI Europe board member and former Minister for Foreign Affairs and EU Affairs, Trade and Nordic Affairs of Sweden. Joining Ann is Nathalie Tocci, Director of the International Affairs Institute in Rome, and our own Olena Borodina, Senior Geopolitical Risk Advisor at ODI Global. Ann, I'll start with you. As I just mentioned, things are shifting very rapidly. Can you tell us more about the latest development? And what do all this reveals about Washington's evolving approach to Russia and its broader strategy in the region?
Well, thank you very much, Sara. And I would say in the future, we would look back to what happened in Munich in 2025 as a start of a long-term change of the security order that we have known since 80 years back and after the Second World War. I think people will compare it to what happened in the Munich conference in 2007, when Putin, President Putin of Russia, laid out his vision for how he wanted Russia to evolve. And after that came the invasion or the conflict in Georgia. It came the annexation of Crimea. And then, of course, the full-scale invasion 3 years ago on the day when we are recording this. And I think that it started also in 2021, in December. I was chair of OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who is guarding the European security order. And the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, he then presented a new proposal for a new order where the Russians' demand was to push US and NATO back and to break with the European security order some of the most important principles, the principle of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and also about democracy and freedom. And what is scary now is that 3 years later, I see that United States is moving in the same direction when it comes to how great powers view security. Going back from an order where small, medium-sized and big-sized countries agree, where everybody has the same fundamental principles, and that the big countries wants to have spheres of influence, where in effect it would mean, for example, that countries that is close to Russia will be open to coercion, and that China, United States, Russia should be able to decide how those countries should choose their own security path. So I think that this is a major shift and a very dangerous shift.
Yeah, totally. Nathalie, you were at the Munich Security Conference, this landmark moment that Anna's mentioned. what were your key takeaways from the conference? Does this indeed signal this growing divide between the US and European partners we're all fearing?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I very much share the analysis. I think what happened in Munich was essentially a sort of double realization. Realization number one, which of course had been already in the pipeline in the previous days, was indeed what Anna was referring to, i.e. the fact that here we have a United States which essentially has a very similar understanding to the world that other big powers have, particularly other big authoritarian powers. And in particular, obviously here, I'm mainly thinking about Vladimir Putin's Russia and probably also Xi Jinping's China. It is indeed an imperial view of the world. I mean, an idea that essentially the world is a jungle in which the law of the survival of the fittest sort of reigns the day. And of course, in that survival of the fittest, those that are up the food chain, i.e. the empires themselves, more or less get by. Those that are middle and down the chain, the food chain, don't end up in a very pretty place. The second realization was that it is indeed, and it's a very European one, that it is Europe, the whole of Europe, which is really on the menu. And going back to a point that Anna was mentioning, in this world in which indeed the big empires actually think that spheres of influence are a good idea, and that almost recognize the legitimacy that they respectively are entitled as empires, they're entitled to such spheres of influence. Basically, you know, sort of Trump's America on the one hand essentially acknowledges the legitimacy that Putin's Russia may have to having its sphere of influence in Ukraine and arguably in the rest of Eastern Europe. And because it itself has an idea that it is entitled to its sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, it is much easier to accomplish this vision of a world of empires with their respective spheres of influence if on the European continent, basically, it is a set of small to medium-sized countries that go their different ways, right? It is much, much harder to accomplish that vision of a colonization of Europe to the extent to which Europe stands united. Now, what is the trick here, right? And it's the trick that is shared both in Moscow and in Washington today. The trick to ensure that division of Europe is essentially through the empowerment of the far right. And this is where J.D. Vance's speech comes in, using, incidentally, a very Russian trope, yeah? I mean, using the language of democracy to argue against, basically, liberal democracy itself. No coincidence that not only did he give that speech in Germany, 8 days before the German election, but featuring very prominently in that speech, it was also another country which is scheduled to have a rerun of its presidential election, i.e. Romania. So very clear basically what the design basically is, because of course to the extent to which you have these sort of little Trojan horses scattered around Europe taking power, then, you know, both of these two empires, and I would argue the Chinese one too, have a pretty easy job to do, right? They don't have to do very much. It's these Trojan horses from within that actually accomplish them at the mission. And so all this leaves Europe in a particularly difficult spot. We have been used, you know, in Western Europe since 1945, in Eastern Europe since 1989, essentially in seeing the United States as the major savior and making that psychological leap, yeah, the step to actually recognizing that, hey, this is not our savior, but it's actually our enemy, right? It's our adversary at this point in time, is a big leap forward, I think, psychologically for us to make and certainly to act upon.
Well, particularly because until the Munich Security Conference, the US had operated under two key principles that, you know, Ukraine must have a say in its own future, and that American and its Western allies must remain united against Vladimir Putin. I think that's why leaders were shocked, you know, to see Trump and his team abandon, you know, both of them overnight. And of course, you know, as you say, pushing these, Trojan horses, throughout Europe. And how do you think this shift will reshape the future of Ukraine, of European security and NATO?
I just wanted to pop in a question to Nathalie, and maybe to you also, Sara, because you're both from Italy. Prime Minister Meloni from Italy was defending the speech of J.D. Vance, and she said that Europe has been sacrificed on the altar of wokeness, bureaucracy, and mercantilism. As Italians, what should we make of this? I will gladly answer your question later, Sara. I'm just so curious.
Sure, Nathalie is based in Rome, so she can give you a more live answer to the question. I watch from the UK, from London, where I'm based, this dance that Prime Minister Meloni does between, obviously aligning herself with the US administration while trying to maintain, a foot in Europe, and balancing the public opinion in Italy. But Nathalie, you know a lot more about this.
Well, look, I have been of this view for a long time. There is no such thing as a moderate far right and an extreme far right. Far right is far right, period. And what I think the distinction is smart far right and dumb far right. And generally, smart far right is far more dangerous. And smart far right tends to act in an incremental way and tends to adjust and adapt to context. And so coming to the case of Italy, Giorgia Meloni was elected 2 years ago. And of course, she was elected in a particular context. And that context saw Joe Biden in the White House, saw the peak of the energy crisis, saw a fairly marginalized Meloni around the table of the European Council, and saw back then the EU that still had to give the bulk of the money from Next Generation EU. Now, in that particular context, smart far right says, oh, hey, I've got to wait a second, yeah? I mean, I can't quite let out what my true colors are. I've got to make these people think that I'm digestible. And so what do? I support Ukraine, right? And indeed, she managed to fool everyone, right? Then what happens as time goes by is that the constraints, those constraints that were there when she first came to power, all start coming off, right? Italy by now has received most of Next Generation EU money. There isn't another big new fund in the pipeline. Italy is now no longer marginalized in the European Council, not only because she managed to fool those on the centre-right and the centre-left, but also because there is a growing number of countries with the far-right in power. Then, of course, you have the added bonus of having Donald Trump in the White House. I mean, the problem with this US administration is not that it's uninterested in Europe, it's that it's far too interested in Europe.
So, and if Nathalie's analysis is right, how do you think the future of Ukraine, European security, and NATO indeed will be reshaped?
I mean, I don't think it was a good sign of European unity after the meeting that Macron was holding in Paris, because actually the different leaders came out with very different views. So I think that the Europeans need to have get their act together. There is one good sign today. Today, when we are recording the podcast, is on the 3-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and the European leaders are in Kyiv today. I mean, both Ursula von der Leyen and Kostas and many of the prime ministers of the EU countries. And I think that is a good sign of unity. But I think that it has been a change. From the beginning, Zelensky tried very wisely to see, is it possible to have a normal political conversation with Trump? To say that, yes, we can have agreements, and yes, we think you are the big deal maker. But now he has changed tones, and he has been, I would say, very tough. He has said, if it's a problem with me, you call me a dictator. If it's a problem with me, I will resign. It should not be about me. If we get security guarantees, if we get NATO membership, then I'm ready to resign. He shows he's a democratic elected leader. And he also said he's not prepared to give United States those, I would call it colonialist, imperialist demands of taking control of the rare earth minerals. By the way, they are not rare. There are a lot of rare earth minerals all over, in a way that is just not acceptable. And now Zelensky has spoken clearly about that. But if he's not backed up by the European countries with more military support, with more humanitarian support and more political support, this could backfire. So there is a big, big responsibility for European leaders. And I know that Zelensky said, now you need to have a European army. It's not realistic. What we need to do is to have much more muscles in the national European countries' defense forces. That is right. But we need to continue to use all of NATO's capabilities, where many of the extremely important capabilities from a strategic point of view is American. So we need to keep United States in NATO. And that is something that they actually have said. They have said that they will stay in NATO. And we need all those capabilities. How far they will go when it comes to implementing Article 5 in an Article 5 situation, I would not bet on that. But that is aside from keeping their extremely important part of the whole NATO organization. So this is also something we shouldn't also here be too naive and fooling ourselves to think it's easy to just decouple America. On the contrary, we need to try to do everything we can to keep them as close as possible while we are muscling up our own capabilities in all different areas, politically, military, and so on.
Can I actually jump in on this? I mean, of course, in theory, I agree, but I do think that, and this is what I'm saying, you know, are we really reading the policy implication tea leaves of what is happening? Because if that was a possibility, and that is, in a sense, the first best, keeping America engaged and keeping America engaged on the side of a liberal, democratic, secure Europe, then obviously that would be the preference. But if that's not possible, if it's not possible because that's not what this America wants. And if in fact what this America wants is exactly the opposite, shouldn't we be planning for the worse? I mean, I find that we're in, and this is what I was trying to get at, referring to the mental state that we're in. It's like we see the politics and where they're heading. We're not necessarily drawing the consequential policy responses. Because if we come to terms with the fact that America may be leaving, well, I wish it was just leaving Europe. I mean, if it was just leaving Europe and not trying to destroy it, it would already be, in that sense, not as bad, yeah? But we certainly, as I said, should be planning for the worst, because I think certainly the unwisest thing that we could do is simply latch on to this hope that the worst is not going to come to pass. If the worst doesn't come to pass, then all the better, right? I mean, if in some way or other the US remains engaged on the right side of the battle, in a sense, in Europe, then that there's only an upside there. But certainly we cannot count on this to happen, given that the overwhelming evidence points in the opposite direction.
But it's very dangerous if we should have a parallel upbuilding of a kind of European NATO. That will be, I mean, for 10 years or more, we will be, having so much trouble that nobody will be secure. I'm much more believing that we are keeping NATO as it is, and also having regional organizations complementary. There is some very, very important joint expeditionary force, for example, which is all the, it's the Nordic, the Baltic, it's led by UK, Britain, who is now having real activities in the Baltic Sea, because there has been a lot of difficulties in the Baltic Sea with the Russian activities and so on. So that is what we do. But we should not fall in a trap to believe that we should start now in a very, very insecure situation to kind of say, oh, they are leaving. Now we have to build something up that is new, that will put us in risk. I totally go against that.
Yeah. Can I get the Ukrainian view on all of this? Because Elena, you follow Ukrainian politics very closely. One discussion, of course, that we haven't touched on yet is that President Trump claims that the US has been far more generous than Europe in aiding Ukraine. He argues that this is what justifies seizing Ukraine's rare earth mineral, not so rare, as Anne says, as back payment. But we know, and President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, maintains that Europe has contributed way more than any other ally, and the data indeed support this, and it shows that European aid has surpassed US contributions. But given everything that Nathalie and Anne have been discussed, tell us how this shift in US policy is being perceived in Ukraine. What is the assessment of Europe's ability to maintain its assistance to Ukraine, to maintain what NATO has been doing so far without a US leading role in it?
Thanks very much, Sara. And first, I want to echo Nathalie's point. I think Ukrainians knew that the US policy under Trump towards Ukraine is going to shift. I think it's still a shock to readjust to the discussion that does not have a conversation around shared values, but more around deals. And Ukrainians have been preparing for Trump to come to power. I think the recent changes in the policy have been quite a shock in Ukraine, because there was anticipation of potentially reduced support, potential discussion around peace with Russia, or a ceasefire deal with Russia, whatever we want to call the deal that will come to pass. But the attacks on the president's office, for example, have come as a shock, because it's not just an attack on Zelensky. Zelensky has a fraught relationship with Trump, but it's an attack on the democratically elected leader and the office of the president. And that's what Ukraine has been fighting for. So the fact that the US, which has shared the values of Ukraine, might be potentially pushing to re-elect the leader when it's not the policy of Ukraine to hold elections under martial law, that has come as a shock. I think that under different circumstances, the minerals deal with the US could have been potentially welcomed if it wasn't packaged up as a racketeering attempt on Ukrainian minerals. And as Anne has pointed out, they are not that rare. Actually, there's quite a few minerals, and Trump doesn't want just rare minerals. He wants hydrocarbon reserves. He wants all sorts of minerals in Ukraine. And Ukraine wants to develop them. But the question is, what does that partnership look like? And how do we have a conversation around this that involves having security guarantees and benefits for Ukraine? I think there is a broad understanding that we're not going back to the discussion around values, and Ukraine might be potentially excluded from those vital conversations. And where does that leave us? I don't think we know where that leaves us or where that leaves Ukraine. On European support, Ukraine has really struggled at the end of 2023 and early 2024 when the US assistance package has been held up. I think the question that Ukrainians have for Europe is whether it will get its act together in time, because that's the question for Europe. The will might be there. The question is, will the different leaders agree under the different circumstances? Because Europe is under a lot of pressure economically and politically. I think some of that pressure might be eased with the German election, which did see the far right, the AfD, gain share of vote, but we will have a coalition government probably that will maintain support for Ukraine. I think the question is whether Europe can act together and act on time, and the time is now.
Yes, that's an important call to action, but we'll have to see who picks it up. And I wanted to also touch on, the shifting global dynamics that will fall from this new renewed engagement between US and Russia. I mean, can these talks signal a realignment in international power, particularly with China, India, global minority countries? Where is that leaving the rest of the world?
Well, I would say, I mean, I was a little bit astonished that I heard the United States politician talk about the multipolar order, because the multipolar order has been kind of a keyword for China and Russia, that they don't want to have a Western dominance. And that is actually now we see that there is starting to be a more multipolar power balance. I mean, China is of course using this situation. I mean, both, of course. If you look at Taiwan, that could be the next big crisis, where China is testing United States' willingness to defend their allies, which of course Taiwan is an ally of United States. It's also, but they are also using the fact that United States now, after 60 years of using soft power in the way of development cooperation and development aid, is just throwing that down the drain. I mean, in the ODI audience, you talk about development aid and cooperation as that's solidarity, that's a moral right. But for a more realistic view, is soft power. And actually now you could see already China has getting into some Asian countries that USA have stopped, and starting to give money to those projects and countries. You also have the Global South, who is trying to balance between, of course, the different powers. And here you have BRICS, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. BRICS, I don't see in the near future they will be a very politically strong organization. They just too much differences and too much power play. But when it comes to economics, when they're trying to not have US dollars as the main currency when you're doing international trade, instead they want to have other institutions when it comes to like the World Bank and so on and so forth. And they have already started, and China has got in with billions and billions of, well, I say dollars, but in their yuan currency or renminbi currency. So that will also, I think this situation will give them a push to also get their act more together. And then you have, of course, the Middle East, who is more and more uncertain what's happening, where United States, President Trump comes with, I don't even have words for the proposal to have the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and making it a European Riviera, and asking Jordan and Egypt to take the Palestinian population. I mean, I worked so close with the Jordanian foreign minister. We worked to reform UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Organization, and to get money for supporting Palestinians. And I know that this is an existential issue for Jordan. And Jordan has been very, very important and strong partner of United States. And now United States is also, they are not only humiliating, but, trying to coerce Jordania into something that is an existential question for that country. And also using threats. If you don't do as we say, you will not get the support, the money and military. So what has happened the last month has implications, as I said, for the global south, for the Middle East, for what China is doing, and also for the whole international order as it has been for the last 80 years. So it's actually it could be much more and grave changes on a global scale.
Thanks. And Nathalie, do you agree with Anne's assessment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I do think that though making this argument, I mean, I think this is an argument that resonates sort of with those that share a particular view of the world already. So I think that the argument that I've heard some people sort of make or try to make to the Trump administration is, hey, I mean, by doing this, you're actually going to empower China more, or you may induce them to do something, sort of aggressive towards Taiwan. I think that the Trump administration doesn't mind. And this goes back to this very explicit endorsement of multipolarity by the Trump administration. In which, and I think this also, by the way, explains the reason why in many parts of the world, apart from the traditional allies of the United States, Trump's rise to power is not necessarily viewed as a negative thing. Back to Munich, I was on a panel with the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and I got into a little bit of an argument with him, because I was basically talking about how dangerous this world of the survival of the fittest is, and he was saying, well, we think there's nothing wrong with it, and we actually think that this more transactional world in which the US seems to almost openly acknowledge its own decline. It no longer wants to be the world's hegemon. It, embraces a world in which there are different power centers with different sets of values and different interests. And as I said, going back to the earlier discussion about what should the policy implications be, I totally agree with Anne that this is not a time to kind of, reinvent the wheel unnecessarily. I do, though, continue to very seriously think that we should plan for the worst, not necessarily act on the worst, but plan on the worst. Because, for instance, I would not be surprised in the slightest if over the next few months or years, we were to see a partial or perhaps even total withdrawal of US troops from Europe. And at least not dismissing that as a possibility because it's just so awful, I think would be very unwise. Now, it does, as I said, it doesn't need, that doesn't mean that therefore invent unnecessary things from scratch, but as Anne herself was saying, kind of try to understand what is it that we could do, sort of within NATO, beyond NATO, to essentially cater for that possibility, which is tragically, and I want to underline this because I don't, these ideas of kind of European autonomy, it's obvious that it's the second best, right? But it's not up to us to choose. So we have to plan, as I said, for the worst.
Well, actually, if I just jump in, Sara, if it's okay, I don't think that the boots on the ground is any problem. I mean, that's not a problem. The problem is the very sophisticated strategic capabilities that United States is providing for NATO. That is the problem. And I also see two other things that I think is interesting in this discussion. One is nuclear weapons. Because now we see that Merz, the coming chancellor in Germany, has said that Germany might have to be under the umbrella of the French and British nuclear weapons. And I think that if we have a discussion on how we can use and be secure of nuclear weapons, we are in a dangerous situation. I just wanted to bring up the issue also of Starlink. That is the world's largest satellite constellation using a low Earth orbit to deliver broadband internet capabilities of supporting streaming, video calls and more, which is used by the Ukrainian military to be more effective, to lead and to know what's happening on the enemy side. And we always talk about how important it is with private-public partnership. And this has been so far a very good thing, because Ukraine has had so much use of Starlink. If they cut Starlink now as a way to coerce Ukraine, they will be blind. They will be blind. Yes, they can continue fighting, but it will be such a setback if they can no longer use Starlink. So this is also something we have to discuss, and this is wider, of course. This is something maybe for another pub.
We can do a follow-up to this. But yeah, we are at time, but I want to come to Olena to ask, if we end up with a concessional settlement in Ukraine, possibly because, of some indirect coercion, as we are discussing, for whatever reason, what are the cascading geopolitical and security risks in your view?
Thanks, Sara. And I would very much like to echo Nathalie's point. I think we need to prepare for the worst, and not just because of what the potential US policy towards Europe looks like, but also because do we really think that Russia is going to hold to any deal that it signs with Ukraine and with the US? I mean, Russian disinformation operation, for example, in Europe will probably continue. Russian attempts to undermine infrastructure in the Baltics, it will probably continue. And we need to be prepared for that. And with Europe not at the table to negotiate potential peace settlement, we're not really having a say in any of those issues. So we need to be prepared for what that looks like if Russia is unleashed, I suppose, on Europe without any limitations on what it can do. My other concern would be the conversation around sanctions and what a potentially desanctioned Russia looks like. It's a Russia that will have access to capital markets to develop its energy projects. It's Russia that has access to capital to develop its mining projects. At the time when Europe is trying to de-risk its supply chains and to be less dependent on China for its minerals, for example, do we really want Russia to have more, to be a bigger actor in international commodities markets? Because that's what's going to happen if Russia is allowed to develop those resources, and we will be ever more dependent on those countries. My other concern is the signal that this sort of conversation around the spheres of influence sends in other regions, and particularly in regions where Europe has been trying to peel away or trying to influence the direction of countries in post-Soviet space, for example, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the democratic well, there isn't much democracy to begin with, but the democratic backsliding and sort of the relationship with Europe will probably take a step back if Russia is allowed to exercise more influence in this near abroad. Because if you're settling a conflict between Russia and Ukraine without Europe, without Ukraine at the table, what you're saying, you're essentially acknowledging the spheres of influence language. And the regions that have been previously under Russia and have been trying to diversify will see it as a signal that maybe that's no longer relevant, and that's not really a real conversation to be having, and what we really should be doing is sticking with our traditional partners. And is that what Europe wants? And but also, is that something that the United States wants? Because if the US wants to compete with China, I suppose, and wants to understand where China is sourcing its materials again and its supply chains, it's not just the Indo-Pacific. It's not enough to just look at the Indo-Pacific. You have to look at Russia, and you have to look at other regions that are supplying China. And you can't really win a war with China if you were to go to war with China, but just having control of the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Anne, Olena, and Nathalie. That's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. Well, as we've heard from all of you, the shifting global dynamics are really raising serious concerns. With US support for Ukraine becoming more and more uncertain, I think Europe's unity and readiness are more crucial than ever, especially considering the rise of China and other powers that are further reshaping the global geopolitics. And the impact of these shifts is already being felt. I mean, the UK has just announced a major increase in defense spending, raising it to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, and cutting its aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3% of GDP, allegedly to help fund this increase, though I personally feel that the imminent visit of the Prime Minister to the US may have played a role in this decision. I mean, there are viable fiscal alternatives to the announced cuts to support increased defense spending that do not come at the expense of the UK's global standing, and which could actually fit neatly with a coherent long-term fiscal strategy, but that will be for another podcast. Anyway, this is a time of major change, shifting alliances, evolving security challenges, rising powers are reshaping the global order. Europe must act decisively to navigate its role in Ukraine, its ties with the US, and its place in a changing world. We'll see where that leads us. Thanks for tuning in. We'll keep tracking these developments as the landscape evolves. You can subscribe to Think Change from your preferred podcast platform. And you can also follow our Blue Sky and LinkedIn channels if you want to hear more about the conversation. And do consider leaving us a review if you are enjoying the show. Until next time, thank you for listening.